Hello, I'm Sonia Usatch-Kuhn, your host. Welcome to Poets on Poetry. I will be speaking with members of the North Carolina Poetry Society, discussing the myriad components involved in the process of writing a poem. My guest today is Joanne Durham, who loved poetry from childhood and shared it with her many students. She holds a BA and master's degrees. Joanne didn't get serious about her own poems until retiring and moving to Curry Beach, where the ocean is her backyard and her muse. She teaches Ekphrastic poetry workshops. When she's not involved with poetry, Joanne plays tennis and practices yoga. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Of the elements such as theme, imagery, and craft, which did you focus on when teaching children in elementary, middle, or high school? Is that where you taught them?
I taught elementary school and middle school, and then I taught teachers. I was an adjunct in some teacher university programs, so I worked with teachers on writers workshop as well. Um, well, I with the kids, the biggest thing for me with kids, with younger kids, is immersion in poetry. And because I think you learn to appreciate poetry, and you learn by modeling, like we all learn so much by modeling. You learn by hearing it and enjoying it. And so what I would do is I had a little poetry shelf in my classroom, and anytime the kids had time, they could just go and read a poem from a wide variety of poetry books, and then they'd stick a name of a poem in a little box. And at the end of the day, while we were waiting for these innumerable buses to be called, we would sit in a circle, and we would read the poems that the kids had picked. And sometimes they'd read them, sometimes they asked me to read them, and we would just talk about them very casually, and but everything comes up in those. If you do this every day, kids learn that there's figurative language. They learn that, wow, that was a really cool image, or they learn that, why did she compare that with that? Or wow, that poem was written from the perspective of the vacuum cleaner. And every year that I did this for about 5 or 6 years, it never failed. I never mentioned the kids writing poetry, but somewhere around October or November, a child would walk in the room in the morning and say, "Miss Durham, could I read? I wrote a poem last night. Could I read it at our poetry time?" And so they just began to write. And then they had the experience and the background to then learn, oh, wouldn't it be effective to use a stronger image here? Or maybe I could tell this poem from the perspective of the tree, but it came through immersion, which I really believe is the best way to learn
And
poetry.
the age of these children,
These were from third to sixth grade.
okay, and what can you say you learned from them when they started writing poetry?
Oh my goodness. Just how much they had to say if you let them say what is important to them. Um, how y- y- they have these lives that don't necessarily get brought into school, but when you let them write poetry, those lives come to school. And you just and how sensitive they are to their worlds, in ways that we don't often recognize, because there might not be the ways we're teaching them, but they're the ways that are coming from them, which is where poetry should come from.
Right. So they found another place within themselves to express themselves freely, is what I'm
Right,
thinking
exactly.
you're saying.
Right. Yes, very much so.
Now, when I was in New York, I did a poetry program, and we had high schoolers on, and they write very differently. Tell me if you experienced this. They write very sad things. Did you find that? high
Well, I
school?
didn't work as much with high school kids. I worked more with elementary, middle kids, and
Oh,
then adults. So I don't want to speak for high school kids, but I think kids write, they write whatever they feel comfortable writing about. And some kids need to write in order to deal with difficult situations in their lives. And some kids write because, they saw a spider on the blacktop and they want to talk about it. So
okay.
I think it's all different things that come out of them.
Talk a little bit about the teachers that you worked with.
Well, I was mostly doing masters in education programs, teaching teachers to teach writing um, with kids, and but again, we did very similar kinds of things with the teachers that I did with the kids to encourage them to write, to just give them really good models and make them feel comfortable, and then they I mean, I feel there's some poetry in everybody, and it comes out when people don't feel intimidated by poetry, when they don't feel like it's, some weird thing that you're supposed to get all the hidden meaning behind, um, and when they feel like they can write from their own lives.
Yeah, I think people feel threatened by poetry, that it will expose them to be not so smart if they don't quite get the imagery and what everything means.
Yeah, I mean, I write pretty accessible poetry, but I still feel that poetry can be accessible and it can also be rich, and that when you really want to, I would try to teach my kids and the teachers, don't use metaphor because somebody told you poems are supposed to have metaphors in them. Use metaphor because you can't really express the fullness and the richness of whatever you're trying to talk about unless you compare it with other things, unless you delve into it and make connections around it. And I think when a metaphor is really sincere and honest like that, I don't know, I just feel like it helps us put our fragmented world together. We put we make these connections between things
Hmm.
that make it richer.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I have to ask you this question because it came up in your bio that you didn't really start focusing on your own poetry until you retired. Now, how did that come about?
I always loved poetry, like you said at the beginning. I taught it with my kids. I did write a few poems that were published in some the International Literacy Journal and the National Council of Teachers English journals. I wrote a few poems about teaching back then, but I have incredible admiration for younger people who work and raise kids and, take care of their families and lives and still write. For me, it was just, I wrote, but I just kept a bunch of journals and I just didn't seriously focus on it. I didn't say, I'm going to spend, a half hour every day writing or something. I just had too much else going on in my life, honestly. And after I retired, I thought it's now or never, really. So go for it. And then I had the time, and that was great.
Okay, so what did you first write about?
Well, I had all these journals. I had all this stuff that I had kept, for years and years and years. And two things happened. One, because we moved to the beach, I started writing about my town. I mean, I'm living in this small little beach town, and it's beautiful, and it's contentious sometimes between people, and there's tourists, and then there's all this ecological stuff. The beach is eroding, and
Yes.
there's all these animals and plants that I didn't really know about, and riding around, I'd ride around town on my bike and just look at everything. And so all kinds of poems came out of that. And that
Hmm.
came actually in my chapbook on Shifting Shoals, because that's all about living in this small beach town and all these different aspects of it. And at the same time, I was looking back at all these other things I had written. I just kind of started pulling together and started thinking about them and writing more. And I knew I wanted to write about being an older woman and and an homage to that, not like, oh, I'm old, but like here I am. I've learned a lot along the way, and I mean, there's hard parts, but there's good parts, and so I kept looking back at my life and how I'd gotten to here, and pretty soon I realized I was kind of writing a memoir, and that
Ah,
became, to drink from a wider bowl became kind of a memoir, and then I started sticking new things in that I felt like needed to be added to the whole thing. So that kind of came together very organically.
I see. Well, that's interesting. Um, so now, are you still writing?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Um, I as you mentioned, I've been teaching these ekphrastic writing classes, both online and in person, in a couple of some of the museums here in Wilmington and in the Osher Lifelong Learning Center.
Oh,
And I, with the ekphrastic poetry, someone invited me to be in a group, a Facebook group that where we write every week. We write to one of many, many images and get a little bit of feedback from other people. And I have found that to be very, very generative. It really helps me. Sometimes you would never know that the poem came from this photograph or painting or something, but the imagery in the art I find to be really, really helpful to creating images. And so I've been doing a lot of ekphrastic writing from art. And I've also always been, um, concerned about the world that we live in, and been an activist for positive change. So, when I read things in the news or things happen, I write about them as well. And I always have felt that my individual life and the world are connected, and so that I write about that too.
I did want to ask you that. So you're writing now at a different level in your life, a little time, different time in your life. Do you find it's more nostalgic or dramatic? And your thoughts about the world scene, have they changed as you've matured and the world is a little different place than it was 50 years ago?
Um, I mean, I hope my writing keeps getting better and stronger and better able to express things and richer. But in many ways, I feel like uh, it isn't all that different, really. The topics may be different, the specifics may be different, but the need for us to, live in a more humane and just world has been around for a really long time. And my appreciation of the good things in my life has been around for a really long time, and the struggles have been around for a really long time. So I don't actually feel I do hope my writing has strengthened, but I don't really feel it's all that different.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. It's not really all that different. So, can I ask you, since you practice yoga, and yoga has that fluidity that poetry should have. We hope our work is fluid. Um, have you ever been inspired by your own movements in yoga?
Well, actually, when I first retired, I thought maybe I'd write for kids because I'd worked with kids all this time.
Uh-huh.
And I actually wrote a whole children's book based on yoga poses. They're concrete poems that each one is in the shape of a different pose and about that pose. And it won an award from the children's literature and the Society for Children's Books Authors and Illustrators Works in Progress Award. But I never got it published. It was very hard to find a publisher, and I tried, and I think the book fell between wasn't really for little kids, but it wasn't really for older. It was sort of in that middle ground, and publishers like their little avenue. to stick something in. So I've never published it, but in that certainly yoga inspired. And then I have written a few poems directly about yoga. There's one in To Drink from a Wider Bowl, and uh, and just the whole, like you said, the meditative quality of yoga, and I think subliminally influences a lot of what I write.
Well, Shavasana reminds me of, you know, they have their milk and cookies and a nap.
Not quite
Uh,
that, but
it's a kind of Shavasana, you know. Okay. Um, just getting back to the ekphrastic, for the people who may be listening and are not really quite aware of what the meaning of ekphrastic is and how it relates to somebody who's going to write a poem about a piece of art. If you
so
could
I
expand a
think the
little.
word comes from looking, discovering. That's where the Greek word actually
Yeah.
comes from. And um, why I've enjoyed teaching these classes so much is that I realized that ekphrastic poetry could be a way in for somebody who wasn't quite sure if they, could really write or wanted to write, or how do you write or how do you start. And it's such a when you look at a piece of art, I one of the classes I called Art Inspires Art, because the art that you see inspires the art of the poetry, because you're already in this artistic mode. You're the artist has already set you up in some kind of way to view something. And what I do in those classes is show everybody wonderful poetry that's been written by, Ada Limon and Ilya Kaminsky and Sharon Olds and Patricia Smith, wonderful poets who are writing ekphrastically, and the different ways they go about it. And I think, again, modeling, really helps people to just go, oh, that's cool. I could do that, and then they jump off and they write great stuff.
Yeah, it's a very good method. Okay. So your words have appeared in many publications, and you've been nominated for several awards, including 3 Pushcart nominations. Tell us about the Sinclair Poetry Prize that you won for your book titled To Drink from a Wider Bowl. Tell us about the theme, and would you please read a few poems from that book?
Sure. Um, Evening Street Press mostly publishes a journal that comes out 4 times a year, I believe. And then they also do 2 poetry contests each year, one for a full length book and one for a chapbook. And I had some poems published in the journal. And so I thought, well, I have this book, I'm shopping it around. I might as well, enter the
Enter.
contest. And I won. And
Congratulations.
that was just a lovely thing to happen. And it was a great experience working with Barbara Bergman, who's the editor. And and as I mentioned earlier, you can kind of see the book cover up there. I'll hold it up, but I think they usually mess up in these Zoom rooms. But so yeah, like I said, it's very very much sort of a memoir of my own life and development, and thinking it's really not so bad to get older. I'll read you the opening poem, which kind of is where the title comes from, and you'll see.
Okay.
It's called Old Folks. Old folks weather things. We hold our tongues when young women bemoan their first gray hairs. We doze off to dream mid-afternoon on worn, cushioned couches, then lie with unclosed eyes through the deep holes of night. There's a haze that hovers above dates, faces, places. When was the summer of the beach house in Ocracoke? Which snow rose over the sills? Memory no longer churs like an eager bird, easing into morning wings, sipping on rain that drifts from every rafter. Time stretches like an accordion, stores lullabies, love songs, and funeral chords between its folds. We are thirsty still, but drink from a wider bowl.
Well, that's a beautiful movement from one place to another and beautifully written. Thank you for reading that one.
Thank
You
you.
are welcome to read a couple of more from that book, if you like.
Sure. Like I said earlier, I feel strongly that my life and the world are connected. So this is a very short poem. It's called Maps. This poem happened because I contribute to Doctors Without Borders, and they always send you a map of the world. And I went to the post office and I had another map of the world, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, well, I'll just leave it here in the post office. Maybe someone else will want to have this map up in their house. So I wrote this poem, Maps. Every home needs a map of the world. Hang it by the entrance. Bless it as you might a cross or a mezuzah when you come and go. Trace your fingers across continents not your own. Say names of countries whose sounds tickle your throat and move your lips differently from your own language. Be curious about who lives there, sharing seas and stars. Hope to meet them, fellow earth dwellers, all calling this planet home.
Traveling through poetry. Tell me before I forget, where is your book available?
So both the Drink from a Wider Bowl and On Shifting Shoals are they're available from the publishers. They're also available on Amazon. If you're in Wilmington, they're in Pomegranate Books, which is our local bookstore. And I have a lot of information about them on my website, which is www.joannedurham.com. Sample poems, some of the other readings I've done, some interviews, reviews, so you can learn a lot more about them, and I list all the places where you can find them on my website as well, www.joannedurham.com.
Okay, and let's move on, if you would like, to a couple of your other published books and maybe select one or two pieces from another book.
Yeah, I'll read one poem from On Shifting Shoals. This one's called You Can't Put the Red Sea in a Poem. You can't put the Red Sea in a poem, a famous poet warned. If you let it in, your poem is crammed with 2 million Israelites clutching babies in arms, with satchels of clothes and unleavened bread. And you've invited in the enormous weight of a God who punishes evil by slaying slave owners' children. So here come the Egyptians as God splits open that unmentionable sea just in time for the migrants to cross and closes it right up on the pursuers. And your poem is choking on all those drowning men, flailing horses, and wrecked chariots. And next thing you know, you have races and nations and power and poverty all spilled in the red ink of misery, and your poem is overwhelmed. It's baffled that he, since it's always he, never sat them all down and explained this wasn't what he had in mind. Those intense 7 days, he created a world so magnificent, people can't stop trying to describe it, which is what happened to me when it snowed at the beach at high tide. Not just a dusting, but a full-on onslaught of snow we hadn't seen in these parts in years, downing telephone wires and snapping tree branches and power out. When the snow finally stopped and the tide receded, it left a wide strip of sand along the shore, snow mounds piled like crystal dunes on one side, and the ocean's perpetual roar on the other. And in between, a tiny miracle of a parting I passed through, kicking scattered seashells like nothing strange and beautiful had happened, nothing that needs to mention the Red Sea.
Lovely. And quite apropos for the times that we're living in.
I guess so.
A good look back to miracles. Let's
Right.
hope. Yeah. You had some nominations for Pushcart, and that's a very wonderful thing, an honor to happen. And let me see. Do you have any other books or some poetry?
Well, I'd like to read a poem. I've been doing a lot of eco poetry as well, poems that, sort of try to help us hope that we won't destroy the world. And this
Please.
one actually was one that won an award from the North Carolina Poetry Society. It's in Pinesong, their annual, um, awards journal. And it's also an ekphrastic poem. It came from a photograph of a praying mantis. So it's called Praying Mantis. Praying Mantis, inches forward on spikes as thin as spider silk, barely whispers her presence, tiptoes over umber leaves, crouches so close she hears the rush of water through their veins. Deadheading daisies in my garden, I almost crush her sleek body, blended to blades of grass as she slips beneath the leaf that dwarfs her shadow, journeys through sticks of twisted bark, seeks sustenance and a temporary temple. I want to tread gingerly through everything that falls, rots, weeps on this earth. She knows the way better, disturbs little, carries 100 million years of ancestral knowledge inside her wisp of prayer. How long will we remain with our heavy souls, ears so far from the ground?
Thank you. As you know, I like to end our program with a love poem, most especially today because it's leap year day.
Right.
So if you have a short
I,
love poem,
I have a little love poem I'd love to read, and it is short. This one is another ekphrastic poem from a Fred Stein photograph called Embrace Paris, and it appeared in the journal Dodging the Rain. It's called Woman and Man in Snow. In the dark street, slick and silenced by snow, a woman and man embrace beneath a street lamp that halos them above their shadows. No sign of a cat, of a car, not even a stray cat stealing a sliver of midnight from a shivering moon. Maybe they are hugging hello, maybe goodbye. With coats so thick, fingers gloved, it must be impossible to feel each other's heartbeat. No, more than possible. Maybe they're young in love and relish the rest of the world's loneliness. Have you held that moment at least once in your life when you could not have been any warmer? Even in a blizzard so blinding, it all turned out to be a mirage.
beautiful. I want to thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest. Your poetry is relatable. That's the goal always, that other people can feel it. And we certainly did here tonight. So thank you again. And I would remind you of Sylvia Plath's word of encouragement. She says, and by the way, everything in life is writable about if you have the outgoing guts to do it, and the imagination to improvise. The worst enemy of creativity is self-doubt. You've been listening to Poets on Poetry. This is Sonia Usatch-Kuhn, Rashawn Media, Peter Rashawn, producer.
Thank you.